Hello and welcome to Army of Crime, your favorite comic book related podcast. I am your host, Matt, and I am here with my co-host, Dustin.
Hello.
Today we are bringing you some comic book related goodness / discussion. We are looking at the French graphic novel / collection of graphic novels called The World of Edena, which is written and drawn by the comics creator known as Moebius. So the World of Edena is a collection of graphic novels that interestingly / humorously originally started as an advert for like a tie-in to a car company that he then kind of expanded over many years. I think what's considered the first part of it was published in 83, and I think the last part was published in like the early aughts. So it's kind of a sprawling collection. You know, as I think kind of as more parts of it would occur to him, he would fill out the story more.
What is the World of Edena about?
Yeah, so the very beginning, like I said, it kind of ties into this car company thing. So the very the premise, like the pitch, the elevator pitch would be that there's two like astronauts in like a sci-fi setting, and they're stranded on a planet, and they are like driving an old car across this planet to try and check out this like mysterious structure in the background. So that's like the tie-in to the car. What ends up happening is there's a lot of refugees from like different planets, and they get transported to what's supposed to be like a paradise world, which is Edena, right? Like Eden. And then there's two people, kind of how like there's two people in the Garden of Eden, right? And I don't there's touches on a lot of stuff from there. It does not take a straight line narratively. But there's a lot of interesting things that happen in there. What did you think of this? What did you think of the World of Edena?
Yes, I liked this comic quite a bit. It starts out in the very beginning. He's intentionally, I think, kind of drawing it using more of like a straightforward and very like simple style. Though then as it goes on, it gets kind of like more detailed and involved. But yes, it's kind of like a sci-fi epic about these two people and a larger group of humans generally starting over on this like paradise planet of sort of like a Garden of Eden situation, and then sort of what goes on from there. Yeah, I mean the art is obviously Moebius is most generally known as mainly as an artist, like drawing other people's scripts. And of course, the art is amazing. I don't know exactly how. I mean, how does one describe the art in this comic book? It's got a mixture of, there are like these vast like cityscapes and stuff like that, but it's definitely not something like when we talked about the other French comic book artist. What was that one that we talked about? That was the other science fiction comic book.
You're talking about the Mad?
Yeah, Jean-Pierre Drouet. It's
Yeah.
definitely not like that, where it's all just like epic with like tiny details and just vast epic landscapes and such.
Like big, those are like big, right? Like in the Mad, by point of comparison, those a lot of the images look like posters that you'd like hang on your wall, not
Yeah,
necessarily like narrative.
right. This is much more grounded in like nuts and bolts cartooning.
Right,
But
but I mean,
is
but it's got he's able to sort of effortlessly, as you say, he does consciously shift art styles as time goes by. But yeah, I mean, there's you've got the vast sci-fi buildings and like the underground world. You've got like the psychedelic elements of like the dream sequences. You've got like the creatures, the detailed like human figures like trudging through the desert.
Yeah, and the colors too, which, is I think one interesting extra element you get from reading French comics as opposed to like some of the Japanese comic books that we've talked about is that these are all in full color, and they're often really like wonderfully colored with like bright reds and greens and stuff, and definitely not like realistic coloring, I guess. It's very expressive and very vibrant. And, just flipping through it now, it is quite like a wonder to behold. I find myself kind of at a loss to think of the proper adjectives to describe why Moebius is so wonderful to look at, but it is. Like he is considered a superstar, or was, he's sadly departed now, but was considered like an international superstar of cartooning for a reason. And this is a pretty wonderful looking comic book to read. As far as the story, it's interesting because in the beginning, it sort of gets into this like very straightforward kind of like hippie-ish idea of like raw foods and like getting back to nature and like the basic necessities of life, because part of what is going on here is that you have these people from an advanced like science fiction civilization who are used to synthesize food and recycled air and all this other stuff, having to get back to the basics of nature in the Garden of Eden. And that stuff to me is kind of like less interesting. It almost at points feels like like a brochure for like a raw foods diet or something.
Yeah. You're talking, yeah, the story where they're like wandering through the garden area.
Yeah.
Or like they're exploring or whatever.
So I think the stuff as it goes on, it kind of like picks up, and I think and gets much more interesting is the story that's basically about how humans placed into a paradise end up just recreating the oppressive, like dehumanizing society that they escaped from, so to speak.
Right.
And that aspect of it I found much more interesting, and it even gets into like what ends up being the villain of this is like some sort of like demonic figure that like lives inside of dreams or something. It's all pretty heady, and I think if you read the introductions to each chapter, he intentionally writes about wanting to leave space for interpretation for the reader to meet him halfway. But like the characters get to this city where everyone like wears these like silly looking masks on their faces, and that stuff
Yeah.
I thought was really interesting. And basically it's like this totalitarian, really oppressive society. And like I said, is you have like the human race sort of rebuilding the structures of oppression for themselves after being placed in a paradise, because that's like what they're used to and what they're comfortable with.
Right. The idea that you transport uh, a large number of humans to some planet that's been artificially designed to meet all of their needs, and the first thing they do is build like a dystopia and basically refuse to live in the world. Like
Right.
it's called the nest, is essentially cut off from the world. They like intentionally avoid it as much as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like there's this weird like god creature thing called the paternum who like rules over it. And one of the two heroes, and this is another interesting element too, because the two main characters named Stell and Adan, I think.
A tan.
Yeah, Atan.
Yeah.
Initially start out as almost like featureless, like genderless characters, and then one of them develops like into a man, and the other one develops into a woman, and the woman ends up being regarded as some kind of like goddess or like messianic character based on this like text that was written by one of the guys when they started this like nest society. As
Yeah.
I'm explaining this, I'm like, I don't know, does this make any sense? Does it make any
Yeah.
sense when you read it?
I mean,
Um,
it's I think it does make sense, but it's kind of like a dream logic. Like it kind of just flows along, and there's parts where the story has jumped forward like thousands of years, and you don't even realize it.
yeah,
Yeah, it kind of follows like a dream logic, I think is a good way of putting it.
because then the last chapter of this is the main character, Stell, is basically like hooked up to a machine so that he can like reach out into his dreams to find Atana, the goddess. So then in the last story, you have like several dreams like nested inside of each other, like as it like burrows like deeper into like his subconscious, and then there's like a warring sort of good and evil like mythical figures that are like trying to help and destroy him. That one actually is probably one of my favorite parts of it.
Yeah,
The last story.
yeah, it's interesting. It gives you a lot to chew on. I did like the evolution of the two main characters because when it started, and this shows some of my reader bias because I assumed they were both men to start with. I don't know if you thought they were. Did you think to yourself, "Oh, these are genderless characters"? I don't. Maybe you didn't even think of it, but I assumed they were both actually men going forward. And then it explains that they're actually that like in the future, everyone that takes like hormone suppressors so that everyone is like genderless.
Yeah.
Um, right,
So
and then
then
so
they
then
kind of go back to this hippie-ish, back to nature, Garden of Eden situation.
yeah, no, and then like the very last part is very cool. Um, that kind of stuck with me. Like I like the ending, and again, it was produced over a fairly long period of time. And it doesn't really he doesn't really like wrap it all up. As you wouldn't really expect him to as you're reading it. Certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if he left it open intentionally to maybe come back to it at an even later point, or if this was just how he felt like it should end. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't, for a story that has so many like tangents as far as like, a heady like science fiction thing, it definitely does not give you, you know, like a pat ending where everything is explained.
Yeah.
It'll definitely remind you of like, well, actually, I mean, I thought of like Inception because it has a guy like in his mind, and then like and then it like burrows like deeper into like different dreams that are like nested inside of each other.
Yeah, there's flavors of that. There is a like a it starts off in like a space opera, space empire kind of setting. Kind of veers into more like almost like a fantasy. And then there's parts of it where the Stell is just like wandering the desert, like fighting off creatures and like meeting people. That could
Yeah,
almost give you like a Conan the Barbarian little bit of a vibe. Like a lone I mean, that might be oversimplification, but like the lone wanderer that's like an archetype, right? The lone wandering um hero, right? I mean, it kind of like effortlessly without you even realizing it as you're reading it, like kind of veers into like different story types, if that makes sense.
yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's. I wonder if it just like came down to what Moebius wanted to draw, or like exactly, or just like what he felt like kind of exploring. But yeah, it definitely like shifts gears sort of frequently in regards to the focus of what's going on, um, because the last part has him in an almost like post-apocalyptic setting of like sort of like walking the earth as the traveler.
Right, right. That's yeah, that like the wandering hero like archetype, or almost like a western setup. Yeah, it's very cool. It's very interesting. The art is great. Like you said, it's kind of hard to explain why exactly, but he has like a distinctive style. Like you can tell, you can see it, and you're like, yes,
Yeah, it's very like clean and very colorful and very expressive, um, and just like the design, like on a design level, all of the like the characters and the settings are all, you know, so wonderful, like the forests and like the chapter 3, there's an opening splash page of these giant like tree trunks that are gray, and then the ground is like colored orange, and the tree trunks reach from like the bottom of the page like all the way up to the top, and it's just, and then you turn the page and there's like a line of trees in this top panel, and then green and then orange in the distance. um, you know, it's just
There's a guy who knows what he's doing
yeah,
as far as art. And then, like we were mentioning, sometimes you get like this detailed art and it feels like stiff, and it absolutely does not. I mean, it reads like, I feel like actually large portions of this you can read without even a lot of the dialogue. Like the art carries a lot of the storytelling on it, and it feels, you know, in motion. Um it feels fluid. It's
yeah.
it's good. I mean, you could read it just for the art. You could say, I'm gonna read this uh because I like the art, and I'm gonna page through it. The
And
stories are of course interesting as well, but there's a lot going on, is what I'm saying.
yeah,
What was your favorite, element, favorite thing in it?
I really like nickel is a good element. Just kidding.
I like their weird dystopia. I thought
The
that was
nest.
interesting. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. And they have like the nose fever, and they're like weird masks with like the things sticking out. Um, I thought that was interesting. That was certainly like a good turn for the story to take. And then they talk about how like this whole fortress, like city area, was already pre-built for them by whatever force created the planet. But this is like what they chose to do with it, was to make this like weird dystopian society, where everyone is scared of disease. I
Yeah,
like the nest as a story element.
right. Because they, you know, the human race is like given a paradise, and they intentionally turn it back into a hell because that's what they're used to.
Right, they can't think of any other way of doing it. And I also really liked the very last, like the last bit, like the last like 10 pages, or like the last sequence. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
Yeah, and this I guess is a spoiler. Normally we try to go spoiler light, but I don't know how else to talk about some of this without just like saying why it's cool. So this is kind of a spoiler for the very last sequence. I don't think it's like a straightforward narrative, like I'm revealing who the
yeah. I
killer
don't know
is.
that you can really spoil it too much, but
Yeah, but the very last sequence is really cool. Where they do some kind of whiplash where he's like, "Oh, actually none of this happened and you're just insane, and we're like treating you, and you have like the space fever or something like that."
yeah,
Yeah, and then um he has getting some kind of like signals as if maybe it was real all along. As the reader, we assume that he's not really crazy, that it did happen, and that this is the like the paternum or something trying to break him.
yeah. Because this other guy named Berg, who's like this tall, like bald guy, is also um, fighting inside his mind for like as like a good guy, kind
Yeah.
of.
And then like
So
the very last sequence, the very end of it then is him blasting off into space to like continue the adventure.
yeah,
And everyone's like, "What's he doing? He doesn't have the codes or the activation codes, and he's crazy." And they're trying to convince him to like turn himself in or whatever. And then he just blasts off to continue the adventure, which is just kind of like the perfect little ending to put on it.
right.
Like, we're just going back into space. We're gonna find, he's still looking for Atana,
Yeah,
the goddess. He's still looking for the goddess, and he's blasting off into space. The end. Just leave it open ended. Like you said, maybe he would have added more to it, if time had allowed. But I think it's a nice little ending. It's a nice little feeling it leaves you with.
yeah. I agree. I really liked the last part. I thought the entire last chapter was really well done. I also liked the whole sequence where you get these guys with their little like spaceship like traveling through the desert. And they have this sort of like junky, like beaten down spaceship that like has broken down in the desert, and it sort of gives you a different feeling from, the beginning is very like clean science fiction where it's like these like beautiful like bubbles and like spaceships that are all like gleaming.
Yeah.
But then later you get this like more like busted down like piece of junk spaceship.
Right. And they're trying
Um,
to fix it, and they don't. You talking about the guys from the Nest trying to fix their ship,
yeah,
where Estelle and then Stell comes across them. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, what other things have you read by Moebius, or had that have him in it? Because like one of the main things that I know him for, and this is a kind of like admitting, um, that you're like an unwashed plebeian, but that he did a like Silver Surfer graphic novel for Marvel that I own. That's actually very cool. It was written by Stan Lee. That was
I
my
read that
entry.
as well.
Yeah.
That is really cool. I've tried to read. He has had a long collaboration with Alejandro Jodorowsky.
Oh, right.
Uh,
And you're anti Jodo.
I'm anti. I've tried. I actually own several, like the In Call, and at least one or two other Jodorowsky Moebius collaborations, and I've never actually managed to finish it because I find reading Jodorowsky to be like one of the most tedious tasks that a human being can endure.
Yeah.
Which is saying something that you can make a Moebius comic dull, like too dull to finish reading.
Yeah.
Um,
I think
so
that's
that's part of my other experience with him. Unfortunately, Dark Horse started putting out some of these like graphic novel, like this was put out. They had like a whole project that they were doing of putting out Moebius stuff, and unfortunately, a lot of his stuff is not widely available in English. But so I'm not familiar with. There's obviously huge swaths of his work that I'm not all that familiar with. I know Marvel published a bunch of his stuff in the early 90s, but those are all like out of print now, and so there's a lot of his stuff that does not have any English language friendly editions. So other than that, yeah, his Silver Surfer comic and his Jodorowsky stuff are the other things of his that I am most familiar with. But he's definitely one of those people where he's a name where when you see it on a comic book, you know that it's going to be worth picking up. It's just a shame that so much of, Dark Horse's Moebius project seems to have fallen off. They haven't announced any new editions for quite some time. So,
Yeah, he famously also did like the concepts for the failed adaptation of Dune, which
right,
isn't really like a thing, but I mean you can like find it online, and they're like cool. Like kind of high concept size sci-fi like uniforms and stuff.
right. That was part of his collaboration with Jodorowsky.
Yeah. That's our episode on the World of Edena, which I think we'd both heartily recommend uh, to anybody interested in comics, sci-fi, comics art, international French comics, whichever. You can check us out on the website, armyofcrime.com. I'm on Twitter at Army of Crime. Dustin is on Twitter at Dustin44444. If we convinced you to go read World of Edena, then you can reward us with some juicy 5-star reviews.
And make sure to avoid the dreaded nose fever.
That's really funny.